All right. Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Everybody is on mute right now. If someone could send me a little chat to let me know that you can hear me, I'd appreciate it. And then we're going to go ahead and get started. So, yep. Thank you, Amy. Oh my gosh, now everybody, yep, everybody's sending me. Thank you, thank you. Okay, got a lot of things going on. Beautiful. All right. Thank you, Richie. All right, listen, everybody, we're going to move this along a little slower because there are people piling in. We've got a good number of folks registered for this webinar. So first, let me thank you for being here. This is our first start webinar for the new membership year or the new school year. And we're very pleased to have with us Todd Yusavage from from FMCSA to talk to us about the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse. Before we get there, a couple things I want to run over with everybody. And I'll do this probably before we get started again. For those of you familiar with our webinar setup, we're going to keep everybody muted simply because all of you are in different modes of location. Some of you are in garage areas, some of you are in private offices, public place, whatever. And it's like a break room or something. So it's easier to eliminate the background noise by keeping everybody muted throughout the webinar. There is a question function, which obviously some people have already taken to let me know that they're here. And through that question function, I will keep Todd updated on any questions that come in during the webinar. Feel free, if something moves you that you see the type of question in, Todd and I have already talked. I'll interrupt during certain parts of the presentation to say, hey, Todd, got a question, and we should be good to go there. We will try to open it up at the end for questions, and I might try to unmute everybody. And yes, this is being recorded. Thank you, Janet. Yes, it is being recorded and will be available for those who couldn't make it onto the webinar, or if there's something that happened and you want to replay it and even replay it for your drivers for that matter as well, or for others in your service. So again, use the question function and I will be happy to take your questions. You will again be getting a copy of the PowerPoint after the presentation. We will make it available to everybody. And again, if you have any other issues, feel free to use the question function and we'll be good to go. I'm seeing, Todd, that we have about 25 people on the line. I'm going to give it a couple of more minutes. So if everyone would stand by, we're expecting, we have about 50 registered. We don't always get everybody, but I'm going to give it just a couple of more minutes for us to get going. So I guess while I do that, I will give a little information on Todd. So Todd has been with the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration for 32 years. He is a native of Pennsylvania, a graduate of Penn State, which will endear you to some of our folks, and others maybe not, but that's all right, Todd. Todd actually started out as an investigator in Arkansas and Indiana. He is currently a federal program specialist assigned to the Pittsburgh area. He has been to a number of our meetings and conventions in the past, along with Tim Cotter as well. He is responsible basically for managing the compliance and enforcement activities for a team of safety investigators out in his area. So that is who Todd is, and we're going to probably go ahead and get started, Todd, because it is 5 after and I want to be really sensitive to people's time. So I'm going to turn this over to Todd, and Todd, it's all yours. Welcome everybody, and welcome to Todd, and thank you for being here.
Okay.
It's all yours.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks for inviting me to this call. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Drug and Alcohol Clearing webinar. As Mike indicated, my name's Todd Yusavage, and I'll be your host for the next half hour or so going over this information. What I want to start out is kind of the agenda that we'll be covering during the webinar. And to start with, we're going to be going over the Clearinghouse final rule, also the timeline, and we're kind of in the beginning part of that right now, how to use the Clearinghouse, Also, I have a number of frequently asked questions that I've added to this. There's also a bunch more on our website, which I definitely think everyone should take a look at as well, because I did go through and tried to pick the ones out that I thought would be most applicable to today. Also, what you're going to need to do to register for the clearinghouse, and also for more information where you can get that from. Now, the clearinghouse final rule, it was mandated by Congress under MAP 21, and it was published almost 3 years ago now, back in 2016, which established the clearinghouse. And what it comes down to is, as of January 6th, 2020, is when the clearinghouse goes into effect. Now, some people may wonder, why are we going through this process? Why is there a clearinghouse to start with? Well, it comes down to a couple different things. Right now, a driver can go and have a pre-employment test at a company, and if that driver tests positive, there's really no way of tracking that driver, because he truly never was employed by that driver. There's no requirement by that company to transfer that information to anyone else. And so really it's incumbent upon the driver at that point to tell the next person he goes to that, hey, I tested positive at that prior company. So we recognize that probably isn't going to happen in a lot of the cases out there. So we're establishing this clearinghouse so that when a driver tests positive, that information will be put on the clearinghouse, and that he can't go from company to company to company, all waiting to get that final negative test where he can start working, for that company there. Also, we recognize that there's been problems with obtaining information from prior companies. Right now you're required to get 3 years prior information on the drug and alcohol testing information, and sometimes I'm sure you're obtaining that information. Other times, I'm sure it's almost like pulling out your hair trying to get that company to respond back to you. Also, there's a number of cases where companies just simply go out of business, so you can't really obtain it any longer. So what's the clearinghouse? What it is, it's a database containing CDL drivers' drug and alcohol program violation information. And it's only for CDL drivers. If you're a company that has drivers that are operating non-CDL vehicles, those drivers will not be part of this situation. And it's reported by the employers, MROs, medical review officers, substance abuse professionals, and like third-party administrators for things such as positive tests, refusals, etc. And the information also includes whether a driver successfully completed the mandatory, return to duty testing process following a violation reported by a SAP. And the clearinghouse will keep the driver information secure. Only authorized users, including agents from our agency, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, will be able to register and access the clearinghouse. Other enforcement agencies, state law enforcement, as well as the state drivers licensing agencies will have access to it. And drivers can access their own information, but not the information of other drivers. The clearinghouse will meet all federal security standards so that the information on there will be kept secure. Now, what are we trying to gain by using the clearinghouse? Part of it is having real-time access to reported violations. It's going to be more difficult for drivers to conceal drug and alcohol violation from employers because of the pre-employment issue. It's going to be easier for employers to meet the pre-employment reporting standards, and it's going to give us more insight to employer compliance. So, we hope, all these things here is going to make it safer for the roads that we all travel on. Now for the timeline, we're into the second phase here, which is the information phase. Next month in October is when the registration is planned to be opened. And that's when you can create your user accounts, at that time. Now, coming in January, that's the implementation date, and that's when both electronic and manual queries will be required. And in January 6th, 2023, 3 years from that date is when you only need to do electronic queries at that point. Up until that time, from 2020 to 2023, you'll need to do both electronic and manual queries, but as of January 6, 2023, only electronic ones will be necessary. Now, who's going to be required to use the clearinghouse? And just to kind of go through, who's going to be the major, participants in this, it's going to be, drivers who hold CDLs, employers, consortia or third-party administrators, medical review officers, substance abuse professionals, as well as the state drivers licensing agencies. Now, in order to gain access to the system, everyone will need to register. And like I said, that registration should begin next month. And, we should all receive some sort of notification at that point when the actual registration is open. Right now it isn't, but hopefully next month at some point it will kick off. Now, the reporting requirements. So employers, third-party administrators, and MROs will be required to report drug and alcohol testing violations to the clearinghouse. The SAPs will be required to report information about drivers undergoing the mandatory return to duty and or alcohol rehabilitation process. And each time information is added to, modified, or removed from the clearinghouse, FMCSA will notify the affected driver. And that's kind of important there. So whenever any information is changed or added to the system, the driver will be notified. But if the driver wants to receive that notification, probably the easiest and best way, that driver is going to need to also register with the clearinghouse. Otherwise, it's my understanding that letters will be sent out, but to receive something more quickly, the driver will need to register. There's also going to be a requirement to do queries in the clearinghouse. Employers will be required to do so for new drivers, for prospective drivers. Also, on an annual basis, companies will need to query the clearinghouse. The National Traffic Safety Board will have access to this information, as will the state driver licensing agencies will have that. In which they'll whenever something is changed or renewed or updated, that information will also be looked at by the state driver licensing agency. Now, as an update to all of this, there's a notice of proposed rulemaking to delay the state driver license agency requirement until 2023. Now, everything else in the clearinghouse is going on as planned. It's only that the state driver licensing agencies aren't required to comply with this until 2023. It's still on a voluntary basis, however, and they can, choose to start implementing the procedures if they wish to, as soon as 2021 comes around. But they do have until 2023 if they wish. Now, just to kind of give you like a visual look on how this is, gonna work. We have the registering, notifying, with the employer and the driver. The reporting is going to be done by the MRO, the third-party administrator, the SAP, and employers. And the querying will be done by the employer, the state driver licensing agency, FMCSA, and to a certain limited extent, the National Traffic Safety Board. What actions will the users be required? I'm going to go across, just the employer one, since I'm assuming that that's going to be the main number of people that are on here today. And as you can see, you're going to be required to register to use it, manage any sort of assistance in here as well. Select a consortium or third-party administrator if you wish. You're going to need to request driver queries through the clearinghouse. Query the driver information and report any drug and alcohol violations through it, as well as reporting return to duty follow-up testing information. As usual, as you can see, the employer has the majority of the responsibility on this, but however, everyone from the driver to the SAP, all has a role in this procedure. Now, for queries and consent requests, there's going to be two different types of screening process that we're going to look at here. The first one is the pre-employment screening. Whenever you hire a driver, you're going to need to do what we consider to be a full query, and that's going to be access to all the information about the driver's details. Now, in order to do that, you're going to need to get specific consent from that driver, and that driver will need to give you that consent through the clearinghouse electronically. The second type of verification we have is the annual verification. And that's going to be considered a limited query where you're only looking for just the presence of information in the clearinghouse. And that can be done with a general consent outside of the clearinghouse. And that can be like in a paper format where it can be for multiple years and it's done outside the clearinghouse. So to kind of recap, because this is kind of an important slide here, pre-employment screening has to be done through the clearinghouse, and you have to get the driver's consent through the clearinghouse to do that. The limited query is done on an annual basis. Every year, you're going to need to take a look at the driver's information, and that's done with a general consent outside of the clearinghouse, where just a piece of paper identifying that the driver is giving you consent to look at that information is good. Mike, I don't know if you want to pause here, if there's any questions coming in. I know this is kind of an important area here.
Sure. At this point, I don't have any questions up on my screen at this point. So I think you can kind of keep going.
Okay, great. And what happens if the driver doesn't give you consent? It's really pretty simple. No consent from the driver to look at this information, the driver can't drive. It's just that simple. Without that consent, they won't be authorized to operate a commercial motor vehicle at that point. Now, the type of information that you potentially might find, this is just an example of one, is this is what you would see if you were to query the clearinghouse and it were to come back with something positive on the side showing that the driver was involved in drug and alcohol prohibitions. And so this is just a slide for an example that this is kind of what you're looking for and what we're really trying to guard against, allowing these drivers to operate out there. A big question coming through is how much is this going to cost me? And just recently, we received that information. There's two different plans that are available. The first one is the unlimited plan, and it costs $24,500. And it's on an annual basis, and it expires after 1 year. This is really intended for those mega companies out there, the ones that have thousands of drivers. And I did some quick calculations. I believe you'd need to do like 19,600 queries in 1 year to make this a benefit. So I believe for the vast majority of the companies out there, they're going to want to use the individual plan on the right-hand side. And what it is, on an individual basis, it'll cost you $1.25 per query. The queries never expire, so once you buy your block, you can keep them for years and years and then re-up them as you go. And this just shows you the bundles that you can buy through the clearinghouse when that part does become active. And for example, say you have a small number of drivers, you may want to say buy a bundle of 20 for $25, and that would give you the ability over time to do 20 different queries on your drivers. The new ones being hired, the annual ones, and then once that that block disappears, you can go ahead and purchase another one. So. And the reason for the cost is, we're actually using like a third party in order to administer this, and so we're allowing them to recoup some of the profit out of having the ability to put this together for us. But what it comes down to is $1.25 per query. And when you weren't looking, we added a whole new section to the drug and alcohol regulations. And those regulations can be found in 382, 701 is where they start. And I just wanted to give a little bit of a short background in each of the areas. Under 701 is the pre-employment and annual query requirements. So if there's something maybe that I didn't maybe touch on today, and if you do have, any questions, you can go directly to the regulations to look this up. Under 703 is where the employer must obtain driver consent to access information. 705 is the reporting requirements for the MRO, employer, the third-party administrators, and the SAP. 707 is where FMCSA must notify drivers when information has been added, revised, or removed. And it's also the drivers are notified when the information has been released to the employer. 711 is the registration requirements. 713 tells us that the registration is valid for 5 years. So every 5 years you will need to re-up your registration, but it is valid for a 5-year period. And if there's no activity for 2 years, it will be canceled. I think what they're looking at here is that, if a company is not using this for a 2-year period, either one, the company is no longer using CDL drivers, or they may be out of business. So we're removing, those companies from the register. There will also be procedures under 717 for correcting inaccurate information, and that is where the driver would want to take a look at information, to ensure that they are obtaining anything, that may have been changed, or anything that they can get access to it. And under 721 is reasonable fees, and that kind of comes, from the $1.25. And the thing about this, for drivers, this will be absolutely free. There's no charge to them. The only fees that are going to be charged are for the companies querying that information. Okay, Mike, before I get into the frequently asked questions, anyone has any questions at this point?
I do. I got a question right now, a couple of them that just came in. So here we go. Let's go ahead and knock these out. And everyone else has questions, please feel free to send them along. First question is, at what stage do we run a query for a new commercial driver trainee who is not yet a CD holder? Is it pre-employment when they have a permit, or after they earn a CDL?
It would be at the permit stage. Yeah, okay. Because at that point, because it applies to both CDL holders and the permit holders. So once they obtain their permitted CDL, that's when you would run that information.
Perfect. Okay. Second question, will a company be able to utilize for all states if you have multiple locations in different states?
I'm not quite sure of the question.
Okay. So it sounds like the company will have locations in multiple states.
Okay.
So I guess the question is, and we can, Tammy, you can send me this again. Will the company be able to utilize, I guess, from one location to monitor multiple states? Let's try that and see if that's.
I'm not sure, because what it comes down to is, once the employer is set up in the clearinghouse, they'll be able to go in and check that information on the driver. So as long as, say, the assistants are set up in multiple states, and say, you've got somebody in whatever, Pennsylvania, California, and New York, and all of those people have access to that information, they all can run the queries themselves. As long as they're authorized to do so. So you can do it from multiple locations.
Okay, and what to clarify, the person, she's asking because they have drivers. In other words, they'll be dealing with drivers in different states out of maybe one single office, and so they just wanted to make sure they'd be able to.
Oh yeah,
utilize it for all states.
Yeah, the drivers can be anywhere, across the country, and as long as you have access in the clearinghouse, you can run drivers wherever. They don't have to be just in the state of Pennsylvania. They can be based out of any other state.
Okay, all right. And at the end, by the way, we'll open this back up again. So if we've missed something here, we can come back to it. I got another question. Do drivers need email addresses to register with the clearinghouse?
Yeah, they do. Yeah. in order for us to electronically send this information, the driver's going to need an email address. I recognize, and I've run into this, a couple times with some other questions, that not necessarily everybody is comfortable with computers and using the internet and things like that, and I understand that. But what it comes down to, in the 21st century, unfortunately, is we all need to kind of move toward the ability to have that email address, so that they will need to have it in order to register and receive electronically any kind of updates to their driving information.
Okay. I'll keep going. If so, are you able to run the query sooner than the permit stage? Because if they're in the query as a positive, would the contractor not want this information before going through the whole training process, clearances, etc.?
It doesn't really specify, how early, you can run it. But if you have a prospective, driver, there's nothing that says you can't run them today to basically determine whether or not you want to go through the rest of the process. And probably that's a great screening method in itself, is that somebody applies today, and for $1.25 you can determine immediately whether or not that driver is going to be able to operate for you. So yeah, you can do it immediately. That's no problem at all.
Good. Excellent. Another question: who is exempt, or any entities? Is a school district exempt? Anyone exempt from this clearinghouse?
Yeah, well, what it's going to come down to is if an entity is subject to the CDL and drug and alcohol testing, requirements currently under the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Regulations, they're going to also be required to use the clearinghouse as well. So if they're currently subject, they're going to be subject under this as well. And I believe most school districts and everyone else is going to be is currently subject to the 382 and 383. So therefore, they would be subject to this as well.
Okay, very good. A couple other questions I can answer myself because these folks kind of came on after I probably covered it. Yes, we will be making the PowerPoint slides available. I'll get that out in an email to everybody following the presentation. Moving on with questions. Do we report the results of all random drug tests or just the positives?
Just the positives.
Okay, excellent. How would a potential employee be in the clearinghouse and they have not had a CDL? I'm going to have to, my screen's, here we go. I'm not sure if I got this one right here. Okay. How would a potential employee be in the clearinghouse if they have not had a CDL before? Then they will not have the drug results in the system, correct? So if they have not applied before or have a CDL, in other words, if they're fresh off the street, I guess,
yep,
have never had a CDL, they're not going to be in that. There'd be no reason for them to be in the system then.
They're not going to be in the system.
Okay. Got it. Do we report? Got that one. And how does the company provide proof of clearinghouse search completion in the case of an audit?
I guess we'll be addressing that in the future. I haven't seen anything from our agency identifying that, yet. I'm assuming that we will be able to go into the system ourselves and take a look and see how many queries the company has completed. But since this is still kind of in the implementation stage, right now we haven't received any information, indicating how we would check on it. But like I said, I'm assuming that we're going to be able to go in, gain access to it as well, take a look at a particular company and see how many queries have been completed. And I think that's probably the easiest way for us, to check on it.
Okay. Who is it? We got more questions. This is great. Who is responsible for officially notifying school bus contractors about this and for ensuring compliance?
It's going to be the owner of the company is ultimately responsible. So for a school bus contractor, it's the school bus contractor, himself who's responsible for this information.
Yeah, and I know we're doing our best to get this word out to everybody, both through this, and we did it at convention and through the newsletter. So we're trying to do it for our members, that's for sure. I do know there might be some people out there just may not have awareness of it. But
Right. And the other thing I would suggest, and I know, we do this all the time, is, to actually, go to our website and have that as honestly one of your favorites. I hate to say that, but, use it as one of your favorites. And on our screen, we always have like updates to what's going on, whether it be the hours of service regulations or the clearinghouse or anything else that might be going on. It's really important that, you take advantage of that information that's out there.
Perfect. I think we've also provided a link on our website too for everybody, and we put it in both the newsletter and Memorable, and so everyone can make it their favorite. So yep, we're doing it. We're trying to help spread the word for you too.
Right.
We have another question. We have a zero tolerance policy. If we have a positive test, we would register it and terminate. Since they no longer work for us, what are our responsibilities for recertification, etc.? So I guess if that person, yeah, okay.
Yeah, none. You would, input whatever information is required on your half or by the MRO. That driver would be positive in the clearinghouse. That driver leaves you and goes someplace else. You're supposed to give him, SAP recommendations where he can go to seek treatment. And then he's more or less on his own at that point. There's no requirement that you retain that driver at that point. When he goes to another employer, it's their responsibility at that point to follow through with the whole, SAP process, negative return to duty test, the follow-up testing that's required in the oncoming year. So it's all put on the new employer to take care of all that information with the driver. The exiting company basically has no other responsibility other than just to give him some SAP requirements, and that's it.
Okay. Is there a deadline for conducting our yearly query?
It needs to be done within the first year. So, whatever is going to be convenient for most companies, and maybe, during a time period, and maybe for the school bus companies, it might be during the summer, when, stuff is kind of wrapped up. And so then you take your drivers and you can all run them all at the same time, say in July. And you'll be good for an entire another year. So every year you'll kind of keep on that same basis, running them every year. However, if you want to do them, individually, one-on-one, and doing them through the entire year, that's fine as well. But it might be ultimately easier, you run them all at the same time each year, and that way you don't miss anybody.
Okay. Another question, the requirement for annual queries to be done for existing employees, is there any guidance of when that needs to occur during the course of the year, or did you just sort of covered that?
Yeah, I think I sort of covered it. Yeah, so within the first year, you're going to need to do an annual inquiry on all of your current drivers. You can pick, whatever date or time or whenever that works best with you. But on a yearly basis, on an annual basis, you will need to do that every time for those current drivers.
Okay. Do all of our current drivers need to be registered in the clearinghouse? So do we need to go back and get those folks in there?
I've got an FAQ coming up that will cover that one. So I'll wait to answer that one.
Sounds good. It appears as though several groups are responsible for reporting a single violation. Are three groups reporting a single violation, or can the MRO be the designated reporter?
Exactly, yes. The reason why we kind of put the employer and the MRO both in there, because certain employers are doing, say, their own alcohol tests. And so then they would report that themselves, any positive. But if they're using just MROs or a third-party administrator, then the MRO would be the one reporting those positives. So there's only one person that needs to report the information.
Okay. We do not live in a perfect world where everyone has an email address, as we talked about. Will it be okay to utilize the company email address to receive consent?
Would this be a driver asking this? Or
for a driver. Well, it'd be, so in other words, if you have drivers who don't have emails, and you have some, and would it be okay for them to, if they utilize the company email address to receive the consent?
I guess the way I'm looking at it, that's the first time I've had that one. But what I would say is everybody can get their own unique email address, and you can use, like, say, the company's address as where it's going to end up at. I don't see any reason for that, but I think there might be a problem if a driver tries to use the exact same email address as the company's email address.
So you might have multiple drivers, and you might have multiple drivers in there with the same email address, and that might be an issue.
Yeah, exactly, because then all of them can see the same information, and we can't, allow that to happen where, one driver can see what the other driver, what the response is or anything like that. So they're all going to need a unique email address. Now, if they want to read that on company computers, that's fine, or go to a public library or wherever to read that information. But they're going to need something unique identifier for them.
Okay, sounds like okay. So yeah, all right, got it. I think we may have answered this one. Do we need to run the query for this year in January 2020, or can we wait until June, July, August?
Yes, absolutely.
For next year.
Yeah, you can wait, but you still have to do it within this first year, sometime between, January 6th of 2020 and January 5th of 2021. Sometime during that time frame, you're going to need to run the annual query.
Okay. The annual query only relates to the clearinghouse, correct? Not the paper process for pre-employment.
Okay, two separate things here. On the pre-employment, the driver has to give consent through the clearinghouse electronically. So in order to check on a pre-employment driver, you're going to need to go into the clearinghouse, request that driver to give you consent. The driver will receive information, and then he'll go in and either give you consent or not give you consent. So he gives you consent, then you can go in and take a look at his information. On the annual basis, on the annual query, the driver, you can prepare a piece of paper that indicates that driver so-and-so gives annual query consents from now to the end of time. And he signs off on it. That's okay. I comply with that. You can take a look at my information on an annual basis forever, as long as I'm with this company. So that's outside of the clearinghouse, and that can be done on paper, which you will need to retain so that we can see that driver has given you that ability to look at his information. So the annual is outside on a piece of paper. Pre-employment is done through the clearinghouse itself.
Okay. What are the ramifications if the employer does not participate in this because they have never had a violation for any current or potential driver?
The companies have to participate. I hate to throw around penalties or anything like that, but potentially on an individual basis, it can be up to $15,000 for violations of the drug and alcohol testing regulations. So it's really important that you do comply. What we're looking at is this is all about safety. We want all of us the same. All of our friends, family, we're all driving the same roads out there, and we want to keep those people that are using drugs and alcohol off the highway. So you're going to need to comply. If you don't, you open yourselves up for our violations as well as litigation out there. I'm sure if one of those drivers hits somebody and they recognize that you're not part of the clearinghouse, I got to believe there's going to be some huge penalties on that front as well.
Okay. And I had a question about whether all these questions being asked will be answered, will the answers be forwarded to us? This is being recorded. I have not provided we might be able to transcribe it, but all of these answers, again, we're recording this entire session, so you'll be able to relive this and even record or speed up to where these question and answers are being asked. We can look into trying to go back and transcribe, but at least initially you'll have recording of the webinar. Is there any guidance whether a school district is permitted to receive query results on our employees if requested?
And I guess I'm assuming that they're using contractors, and the school district potentially wants to know what's going on with the drivers under contract to them.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I haven't seen anything. It's still going to be a requirement by the contractor to obtain that information. Whatever way that information is going to be given to the school district is going to be kind of between the contractor, the driver, and the school district. I'm not going to get into the legal ramifications of releasing that information, but it seems to me that truly there should be something in writing that the driver is aware that the contractor will release this information to the school district upon their request. Because technically, really the only ones that are authorized to see that information would be the contractor himself. So I'm going to leave that up between the driver, the school district, and the contractor to determine how that information might be filtered to the school district.
Okay. That is all the questions I have at this point. That was a great lineup of good questions. So
yeah, that was a bunch, and I do have I do have a number of different slides for some frequently asked questions. So this may also jog some questions as well. But let's get into this next section, and we'll see if anybody has any other questions after this.
Sounds good.
Okay, will the violations that occur before the rule is implemented be included in the clearinghouse? And the answer to that is no. So only those positive tests that occur on and after January 6, 2020 will be included in the clearinghouse. What I guess is somewhat nice for this is that you don't have to go back and try to input information on previous positive tests or anything like that into the clearinghouse. So we're saying on January 6th, this is when it goes active. Only those positive tests at that date and on will need to be input into the clearinghouse. And does the final rule change any of the existing requirements in Part 40? And the answer to that is no. No changes will be to Part 40. How long will the driver violations be in the clearinghouse? This is kind of another important one. Once a driver has become positive, that information will be in there for 5 years or until the return to duty process is complete, whichever is longer. And the whichever longer is kind of the important part there. So if a driver tests positive, he leaves and comes back 10 years later, that information will still be in there because he never completed the return to duty process. So that in that way, we'll be able to track that driver for years to come. So he won't be able to circumvent, that positive test. And our Social Security number is required to be entered for driver violations. And the answer to that is no. The way we're going to be using the clearinghouse is that it's going to be based on the driver's CDL number and issuing state. And so that's the way we're going to identify the drivers in the clearinghouse, not with Social Security numbers. And Mexican and Canadian drivers, if they're subject to the requirements now, they're also going to be subject to the drug and alcohol requirements when the clearinghouse takes effect. Okay, this one I probably received more questions to than anything else. Will every driver need to register in the clearinghouse? And the answer is no. And I know we've probably got people out there going, what? But what it comes down to is if a driver stays at one particular company, he never incurs a drug or alcohol violation, and he never leaves that company, he doesn't need to join the clearinghouse. And I know there'll probably be some questions, at the end of the presentation over it, but what it comes down to is if they stay at one company, never leave that company, never seek employment anywhere else, that driver doesn't need to register. My recommendation is that the driver does. The reason for that is if anything changes or somebody puts information in there or anything like that, that they'll be able to gain access electronically to see what was just put in on that driver. So recommendation that you do join it. But if you stay one place, and nothing ever happens, nothing changes, you don't technically have to register. Can employers register their drivers? And again, the answer to that is no. Each driver individually will have to register themselves, in the portal. Registration logon will be required for the verification process.
Hey, Todd, I do have a quick question for you.
Sure.
How do you do a limited annual query if the driver isn't in the clearinghouse?
Yeah, what is it? Since there won't be any information on the driver in the clearinghouse, there won't be any information to see. So what happens is that they'll do the annual inquiry. There won't be any information on that driver in the clearinghouse, so it'll come back as a negative. So no harm, no foul at that point.
Great, thank you.
Okay. And are employers of non-CDL drivers who operate CMVs required to query or report violations to the clearinghouse? And that's no. Only employers subject to Part 382 and 383 must query or report information to the clearinghouse. So if you're using, smaller vehicles out there, non-CDL vehicles, you're not subject to this requirement. Okay, what happens when there's information following a limited query? And these would be the ones on an annual basis. You're required to obtain the driver's consent for a full query. You must conduct a full query within 24 hours, and if the driver refuses consent, he can't operate a commercial motor vehicle. Does an owner-operator have to conduct queries on himself? I know this may sound a little silly, but yes, rules apply to the owner-operators just like they apply to any other company out there. They still have to do queries on themselves. Will tests conducted under other DOT modes be included in the clearinghouse? And it's no, only those administered under FMCSA requirements. And this would apply to those like that may be working part-time, say, for Federal Rail or FAA or one of the other administrations out there. Only tests conducted under our mode will be in there. And will a driver's follow-up testing plan be available in the clearinghouse? So if the driver tests positive and you're the next employer for that driver, that information about his follow-up testing will not be in the clearinghouse. You'll need to go either to the substance abuse professional or to the previous employer to obtain that information. It won't be contained in the clearinghouse. Only the tests information will be in there. The actual plan will not be. And what information must employers report? Okay, alcohol confirmations 0.04 or greater, negative return to duty tests, driver's refusal, actual knowledge under 382-107, and successful completion of all follow-up tests. And that has to do with the driver who had tested positive previously. How much time do you have to submit this information? You need to do so by the close of the 3rd business day. And
okay. Do have a couple questions for you though.
Okay.
I think related to what you just talked about. So if our current employees have been with us prior to January 2020, do we only need to query on those that have joined us since that come with a CDL?
Yes, those will be the pre-employment ones that you'll need to do, right? Everyone's, whenever you hire a driver, you're going to have to do that full query. And for any of your current drivers, you're going to need to do that limited query on a yearly basis.
Okay. If drivers are not registered, how does the employer get query information?
Okay. So for a pre-employment basis, the driver's going to have to be. He's going to have to be registered in there because that's the only way that the driver can give consent to start with. So if you go in there, you're looking for information, you're going to request consent from that driver, and that driver's not in there, everything stops at that point. You can't use the driver. He's going to have to register in order for that pre-employment query to take place. And on an annual basis, the reason that he doesn't have to be necessarily in the clearinghouse is that that's done outside of the clearinghouse. That's done on a piece of paper where he allows you to do annual queries on a regular basis outside of the clearinghouse, and he gives you that. So, for him, there won't necessarily be anything in the clearinghouse. You can still check on his driver's license in the state that he's licensed into, but that information, there won't be any information on him unless he did test positive previously.
Okay. Quick question here, or kind of a quick question is, the blood alcohol content, the limit for a school bus driver is 0.02.
Yeah. But to be in the clearinghouse for a positive test under our regulations, it's 0.04 and above. There is a requirement in our regulations between 0.02 and 0.4 that you've got to stand that employee down. I believe it's for 24 hours. But at 0.04, that's when it becomes a positive test. And that's when that information has to be input into the system. Anything under 0.04 is not considered to be a positive test for clearinghouse purposes.
Okay. The close of the third business day requirement, would that be based on when notification is received by the employer?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, that's all I've got so far.
Okay, great. Great questions. Okay, MRO responsibilities. Within 2 business days, they must report positive tests, refusals, as well as if the specimen's been adulterated or substituted. And for SAP responsibilities, they have to input their SAP contact information, the driver's name, date of birth, CDL number, the date of the driver's initial assessment, and the date that the SAP determined that the driver successfully demonstrated compliance with the program and is ready for the return to duty test. Now, for drivers that have tested positive, they must select the SAP through the clearinghouse for the return to duty process. So if you do have a positive driver, they will need to go through the clearinghouse to obtain a SAP that they can use. Now, how does a driver change or remove inaccurate information? Now, this will be through what we call data queues through our system. And the driver must put in, contact information, his CDL number, state of issuance, and also, information why, this information is incorrect. And one thing that a driver can't challenge, and you'll see that at the bottom in red, is the accuracy of the test, and refusals may not be challenged. But if there's something else that was input incorrectly, and we recognize that, we're going to have different people inputting information, whether it's the employer or the MRO or the SAP, that, certain things may, could get in there potentially inaccurate. So, the driver does have that ability to petition and get that inaccurate information removed. But if it's based on, a positive test or refusal, that's going to stay the way it is.
Gotcha.
Now, what everyone should do, and this is my suggestion, is in order to get updates, is to go into our system and subscribe to the updates for the clearinghouse. It's been pretty useful for me, especially I've done it myself, where you'll get the updates of any changes that are coming up with the clearinghouse. And what you can do is, this fall, which is, just around the corner next month, is, when it goes into effect, register your company, designate, any, consortium or third-party administrator, Set up any assistance if you might be using them, and also encourage your drivers to participate in this program. Because, like I said, any driver on a pre-employment basis, you won't be able to use that driver unless he registers in the system and gives you consent in order to query his drug and alcohol information. And if you would like some additional information, this is the website for the Clearinghouse. It's got a bunch of information. It's constantly being updated, and you can subscribe for emails. Like I said, I went through a number of frequently asked questions, but I only kind of scratched the surface. So there are a ton more that are in there, and it is probably well worth your time to go through and read through them. You can also download. There's a fact sheet in there. And there's a user role card, which kind of helps give you an idea what your responsibilities are going to be. So if you do have any kind of questions, I would go to the Clearinghouse website here, and also in the regulations themselves, we have gone through and identified what the requirements are. And Mike, that's pretty much all of my presentation here.
Okay.
If there are any other additional questions, I'll be glad to answer those.
There are. Here's a couple, about three more I've got coming in here. Okay. Do I need to run a query on any driver I hire who has a CDL but is only going to be driving a passenger van?
No. What it's going to be, and we recognize this fact too, just because a driver has a CDL doesn't necessarily make him part of the drug and alcohol testing program. Only those drivers that are operating vehicles requiring, CDLs are going to be part of the program. So, you can have a certain number of drivers who have CDLs and they've had them for years and they want to keep them. They're not part of this program if they're not operating a vehicle that would require them to be part of the drug and alcohol testing program.
Okay. Could you please clarify who is an MOR and who is a SAP?
Okay. An MRO is a medical review officer. That's the person who is reviewing the test results after a driver, gives his specimen. He's reviewing the results from the laboratory. And that's the person who is going to indicate whether or not that driver is positive or not positive. The SAP, which is the substance abuse professional, that occurs after a driver is tested positive. In order for that driver to get back driving again, he has to be evaluated by a substance abuse professional. He goes to that person, he goes through an evaluation process. That person then indicates what type of, what's required of that driver at that point in time. It may be in-house, where he has to go to like a place to obtain help, in person, or it may be outpatient things like going to an AA meeting or something like that. And then he also prescribes how many follow-up tests are required by that driver for the oncoming years. So that's kind of the difference between the two. The medical review officer is the one who designates whether a driver is positive or negative. The substance abuse professional is used after a driver tests positive. They've got to go to that person in order to be evaluated to see if they need, like inpatient care, or if they can do something out of that, and they will set up how many tests are needed in the oncoming years.
Okay. So following up on that from the same questioner, because I guess the question is, and contractors are neither of those. Correct. And
correct.
So referring back to the termination question earlier, you had stated that we may have SAP requirements, and I think that's where there might be some confusion as to whether that was meant for the contractors would have those requirements.
Yeah, well, what will happen is if, say you hire a driver who was previously positive, he was let go from the other company because he tested positive. Now, if you hire that driver, you're going to be subject to all the SAP requirements, which will be typically, he's going to need a negative return to duty test before he can start operating again. The SAP will detail out how many follow-up tests are going to be needed at that point, which can go on for years and years. there's a minimum of 6 follow-up tests in the first year after a driver's tested positive, but the SAP, based on his experience, can indicate more than that. So you would need to follow the SAP's plan and make sure that driver participates in all of those tests for whatever length of time.
Okay. We talked about a positive test at 0.04 for alcohol. What is the requirement for a positive test for drugs?
That's going to be, that's already determined. The laboratory tests at a certain cutoff levels, and once that cutoff level is, goes above that, the MRO is going to be notified that that driver tested, say, positive, say, for marijuana at above the certain cutoff level, and the MRO will review that. He'll also supposed to try to contact the driver to see if that driver has some excuse or reason why he would have tested positive, for whatever particular drug it might be. There may be certain situations where he's been put on prescriptions or whatever, and the driver would need to then tell the MRO, well, these are the drugs I'm taking, and the MRO would then review those drugs and determine whether or not he would put negative or positive on that. An MRO can actually can change, that positive may ultimately become a negative based on what that driver has told the MRO, and can prove to the MRO based on the medications he may be taking.
Okay, these next two questions might be related, Todd. If a current employee that is a non-DOT decides to upgrade to a CDL license, do we treat them as a new employee for the clearinghouse?
Oh, good question. I would say probably yes, but that's one I might have to check on, Mike. It seems like once they enter into the CDL arena, that they would almost be treated as a new employee in that area. But that's a good question, and I can check on that one.
Okay, if you want to get back to me, we can get back to everyone on that one. If a driver, this may be similar, if a driver has a CDL and is hired for non-CDL driving, but then switches to a CDL position, will they then need to give consent to a query? That's a good question.
They were non-CDL.
They have a CDL.
They're CDL now.
Yep. Hired for a non-CDL driving position, so they're not really utilizing that CDL, but they switch to a CDL driving position. Will they then need to give consent to a query?
Yeah, only on the pre-employment one again, and that kind of like goes right into the prior question. So it all comes down to whether or not we're going to view a person transferring from a non-CDL to a CDL within the same employer, whether that would be considered similar to a pre-employment situation. So I'll need to check on that one, and I think the answer I get should be able to answer both of those questions.
Okay, so what I will do is I've got both of these questions here. I can get them over to you just so you have them in writing. You
Sure.
can get them back to me, and I can get something back to the group here so that they can all get answers. That's great.
Okay. I hate it when you stump the presenter, but that's a very
it is. Could you please explain again the slide where you mentioned that if a person has worked for you for many years, they will not be in the clearinghouse, yet we are to annually verify our employees?
Yeah, that's the one way back on that frequently asked question, that does every driver have to be in the clearinghouse? And the answer to that technically is no, even though I probably recommend that all drivers do get in the clearinghouse. But what it comes down to is if you have a driver who's with you currently, and he never plans on going, anywhere else. He never has a drug or alcohol testing program. He doesn't have any secondary job in the driving industry, anything like that. That driver does not have to go into the clearinghouse and register if he doesn't want to. When you do your annual query on that driver, you'll go in, you'll punch in the information, and you'll see that there's no information on that driver, so everything's fine. Since his consent is outside of the clearinghouse, he doesn't need to register if he doesn't want to. And I know,
Okay.
it may not make complete sense. You're trying to wrap your mind around, well, why does the guy who goes from company to company have to be registered, but the guy who never leaves my company, he doesn't have to register? Um, I think the main reason is for pre-employment drivers, they have to give consent through the clearinghouse. So they've got to be registered, the pre-employment drivers. The guys that stay with you forever, they don't need to go through the clearinghouse to give you consent. They can do it outside with just a piece of paper. So therefore, they don't have to register if they don't want to.
Okay. Great. So to be clear, and this is coming from a question just to, I guess, reconfirm. So to be clear, the only drivers required to register with the clearinghouse is someone that is a new hire CDL pre-employment occurring on or after January 5th, 2020.
That's correct. That's correct.
Okay. If my employee is non-CDL, but and is on my random, I assume is on my random drug testing or my random testing list, but switches to CDL, do they need to be in the clearinghouse?
Okay, first of all, if he's a non-CDL driver, he shouldn't be on your random drug testing list to start with. So
Okay.
any employees that are not operating CDL vehicles should not be in your drug and alcohol testing pool. They should all be taken out, immediately if that's the case. So only those drivers that have CDLs and are operating CDL vehicles should be in that pool to start with. And I'm sorry, Mike, what was the second part of that question?
So, and do they need to be in the clearinghouse? So if they switch to CDL, do they need to be in the clearinghouse?
If they switch to a CDL and they're operating CDL vehicles, yes, they would need to be in the clearinghouse. If on a pre-employment that they would have to register on an annual basis, they wouldn't technically have to register as long as they're still working for the same company.
Right. So and I think to clarify, yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
No, I'm sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
And I think to clarify that, the reason that is you will have, for example, you will have some who are testing those folks. They're just going to be in a separate pool, not necessarily in the same pool. And we also have a local insurer who is requiring contractors to random drug test those folks as well.
Yeah, and I can understand that, especially when we're talking about school kids being transported. There may be a requirement, say, by the school district that everybody who transports kids are going to need to be in some sort of drug testing pool. What needs to occur at that point is a separate pool outside of our regulations, and they can be in a separate pool with different standards, whatever you want at that point. But they do need to be in a separate pool, not with the normal CDL drivers.
Okay, excellent. All right, I'm going to. It's 11:07. If there aren't any other questions, I'm going to try to unmute everybody. If that's going to work, I don't know if that's going to work or not. So I don't know if I'm having a little difficulty unmuting all. Okay, I guess you could unmute yourselves if you wanted to. It is almost 10 after 11. This has been tremendous. We've had a lot of good questions. Does anyone else, before we go, have any other questions they want to type in? Because I tried to unmute everybody. Let me see if I can do it this way. And doesn't look like I'm able to. So, all right. If anyone has any other questions, please forward them over to the question function. I got someone who just said, "Awesome job, Todd. Thank you."
Thank you.
And I think what we'll do from this point is say we'll get answers to these questions. Everybody will be getting a survey from us on this, as well as the handouts as well. We will also send you a link to the recording. It takes GoToWebinar just a little bit of time to process that, but we should have that for you later today. And we'll get answers to these two outstanding questions from Todd as well. Todd, thank you so much for doing this for us. We really appreciate you and the team over at FMCSA and for all their support of for helping us get answers to our folks.
Oh, no problem at all, Mike. We're always happy to help any way we can, and we appreciate everybody out there, listening today and then trying to gain some extra information.
All right, everybody, have a great day. We'll try to keep everybody, updated on what's going on with the Clearinghouse. So continue to watch your newsletters, and if you have questions, please let me know. Thank you all again. We're going to conclude this webinar at this time. Have a wonderful day and stay safe, everybody.